Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for This Is Now Live. I'm really excited about today's session because it is one that you all asked for. We talk about sustainability around here a lot, and if there's one thing that's true about this topic, it's that the more you learn, the more questions you end up having. So over the last few sessions, we've gotten so many great questions about impact that we haven't had nearly the time to answer them all. So today I've invited my friend Maxine Bédat from the New Standard Institute here to help dig into some of your questions and help understand the nuance behind them. Maxine is one of those people I go to with my questions. She's smart, like really smart. And I love the way she thinks all the way around an issue and never takes any answer at face value. Marketing is never enough to convince her that something is a solution. And that probably has something to do with her training as a lawyer and her time as the CEO of the much beloved former fashion brand Zodi. Now Maxine runs the New Standard Institute, and I'd love to welcome her here to have us tell her more about that before we dive into questions.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a delight always to speak to you about all the burning questions and the burning issues with regard to sustainability. So I am Maxine Bédat, as Carrie said. I'm the director of the New Standard Institute, and what we are doing is using data and really the voice of scientists and researchers to help drive measurable change within the industry. So I think important to that is we are an independent organization, independent nonprofit organization. We are not funded by any aspect of the industry. So we really just get to speak to the voice of the scientists and the researchers. And I came at this work, as Carrie mentioned, from law and from my work at Zodi. And so I saw from brands just how many questions that they had. And what I realized is where we could make most impact is really helping brands and people and media understand their role, understand the impact that fashion has, and what we can do to start reducing the impact and building back better. So that is me in an aside.
And now everybody can understand why I'm so excited to have you here. And Maxine, before we dive into everybody's questions, I think there's some foundational stuff we should cover. A lot of things, we assume everybody is playing from the same playbook, but I want to make sure we're all coming from the same space. And one of the things that you and I have always agreed on is we're both big fans of saying there's no such thing as sustainable fashion. And I always kind of know that a brand hasn't really done all their homework possible if they're saying we are a sustainable brand. I always say nothing's sustainable because everything has impact. I often find that shocks people, but can you tell me what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, so it's exactly what you just said. We're an industry that's not planting trees, right? So we are producing a product that will always have an impact of some kind. And so really the work that we're trying to do is to help move away from this kind of very black and white conversation that the industry has been in thus far of this is a sustainable product or a sustainable brand versus everything else, to what is this product or what is the brand trying to do to reduce impacts? Because embodied in a product are the impacts, whether you are talking about them or not. So they are there, and it's whether a company is accurately talking about what they are doing to reduce an impact. But they're there already. Nothing that we create is ever going to have zero impact. And so we should really be moving away from this language of sustainable fashion, a sustainable garment, to what are we doing to reduce impact? It's really that simple.
Right. Sometimes when I'm teaching, I talk about, try to measure sustainability. You can't do it. There's not even an agreed upon defined definition when we're talking about the fashion industry for what sustainable means. It means something slightly different to everybody, but impact is something you can measure before, you can measure after, and you can see which way you've made the needle go. So let's talk about sustainability and climate change. Can we talk about how they're related, what one is versus the other?
No, just kidding.
Wait, did you say no?
Just kidding. So they are interrelated. So I have a definition of sustainability, even though you just said there isn't one, but this is what Merriam-Webster has to say. Sustainability of relating to or being a method of harvesting or using a resource so that the resource is not depleted or permanently damaged. When we think about resources, that broadly includes the livelihood of people, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the soil we use, and the Earth's climate on which we all live. And fashion impacts all of those things. And so climate and climate change, we're talking about Earth's climate on which we all live. So it's one component of sustainability, and it is a serious component. And I think it's just important when we talk about climate change, because it's this thing it gets thrown out a lot and said a lot. I have a quote here from Bill McKibben that I think just grounds this conversation. So he says, climate change has become such a familiar term that we tend to read past it. It's part of our mental furniture, like urban sprawl or gun violence. So let's remember exactly what we've been up to, because it should fill us with awe. It's by far the biggest thing humans have ever done. This is humanity's largest accomplishment. Thank you for.
Damn.
All right, but and fashion, how fashion plays into it is that fashion is between 4 and 10%, depending on what study you're looking at or whose research you believe. 4 to 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is causing this climate change. And I know part of the side interest in NSI is really elevating to the broader outside this industry, the role that fashion plays in our world, whether it's regard to climate change, the economy more broadly, or even kind of its historical links. But fashion has a massive role to play in climate change, and it has a massive role to play in the broader sustainability conversation.
So you just mentioned, depending on which research you believe, 4 to 10% of all greenhouse gases are caused by the fashion industry, which is pretty staggering. But let's talk about what greenhouse gases are. We hear a lot about carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
What
are they?
Can we talk greenhouse gases?
Let's talk greenhouse gases. So definitely we hear a lot about carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, and climate change, and it's all kind of like smushed together. So to unsmush those things together, when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, the main ones that we are talking about are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide is the most prevalent, and so that's why it is oftentimes collapsed into the broader GHG, which stands for greenhouse gas emissions, and carbon are used synonymously, but they should not be. And then if we just quickly map on where the greenhouse gas emissions happen for the most part on to the supply chain, because for me personally, when I think about sustainability and I think about impact, I really just try to bring myself physically to the places on the supply chain to understand what it is that we're actually working on. And so if we think about raw material extraction, you're going to see a lot of carbon. Oh, there we go. You got a fancy chart. We see, this is a little chart, just a step back here, of the supply chain. Where you have fiber, textile, which is your mill stage, and cut and sew. And on the left is the impact areas. So water, chemical management, labor, and greenhouse gas emissions, which track on pretty closely to that definition of sustainability. But back to the greenhouse gas emissions. At your fiber stage, there will be nitrous oxide released on fertilizer application, and CO2 on with your tractors, the use of tractors, also at the chemical plants to create synthetics, and then of course, synthetics are made up of carbon.
Let's
And
pause for a second. Can we talk about what synthetic fibers are and what they're made of? Just
yeah,
so,
so they're mostly derived from fossil fuels. Well, they're all derived from fossil fuels. They're mostly derived from oil. It's one type of fossil fuel. And they are today the predominant fiber source. Their polyester is is more than 50% of fiber that is used these days. So it is significant, but just a little technical note here, that the synthetics are made up of carbon, which is not an emission in and of itself. So when we think about greenhouse gases, they are greenhouse gas emissions. So they become bad when they are emitted in a gas form. So if you are using a synthetic material and then that synthetic material gets burned, for example, in disposal, all of that carbon embodied in that product is going into the air as emissions. So yeah. And then on the going back to where the greenhouse gas emissions are, really the hot spot is at the yarn to textile phase, where according to a Qantas report, over 75%, 76% of greenhouse gas emissions across the entire supply chain is happening at the textile mill itself. And I think that's just super important to consider because, again, going back to our previous part of the conversation around sustainability and sustainable materials and sustainable fibers, like it seems there's so much emphasis on what material you are using, when really in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it's less what material you're using and where are you turning that material into a fabric. And then finally, on disposal, as I just mentioned, you'll see a lot if a product is burned, which happens frequently because we are sending our clothing to the developing world and it doesn't get sold and it oftentimes gets burned there.
As an alternative to it going to a landfill and sitting in a landfill.
Yeah, and in a landfill, the natural fibers will break down and produce methane, which is a greenhouse gas. Some landfills try to capture that methane and turn it into energy. And then your synthetics in the landfill will just stay there. Hello.
All right. Okay, so so the hotspots in that life cycle of clothing, you would say, are really in that extraction and mill stage?
It's really the mill stage. That's where 76% is in the mill stage. It's not in the extraction stage, it is at the mill. So it's kind of like regardless of the material that is used, the real area of focus, if we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, has to be what is happening at our mills.
Right. So one of the other things that I want to reframe, and then we'll get into some more of the questions that everybody's asked, is we hear a lot people talking about people and planet being the things that sustainability covers. And you read that great definition based on the Webster definition. And there's these two sides of the equation: the use of our natural resources and fashion's effect on the planet, and then the human beings working in and affected by the supply chain. So can we talk about that relationship? I think sometimes, to your point, brands talk about materials a lot because it's something that's easy to change and it's easy to measure. What about that human component? How are they related?
Yeah, so if we could get that chart back up, I can kind of speak to it on there. Otherwise, I can just speak to it. So when we're talking about the labor side of things, there we go. The real hotspot here is in the cut and sew stage. And that is, again, if we really transport ourselves to the supply chain, where you see the most people is at the cut and sew facility. And that is because we have not automated that. it is still if you look at your own thing you're wearing today, every seam, every placket, every belt loop is stitched by a person sitting at a sewing machine. And I like one factory that I was in not too long ago, they were talking about a single button down shirt is made of 40 separate pieces that takes 50 steps, 60 machines, and is operated by 30 different people. And that's for one shirt. So that's really the hot spot when we're thinking about protecting people is what is happening and where and how those people who are doing the cut and sew are being treated. And then, I mean, of course, there are people operating the textile mills and, the cotton farmers as well. So there are people issues throughout. And of course, like, what does your board look like? What does your management look like? Is a very important thing to consider as well. But in terms of just sheer numbers, it's at the cut and sew facilities.
Got it. All right. So we're going to get into some questions now. And Maxine and I were reviewing these and we were so excited because there's so many good ones. And we're already getting more in the Q&A. So again, please ask your questions in the Q&A function. If you have more, anything we don't get to, we'll send a follow-up newsletter as well as a recording. So just feel free to take in the conversation and we'll get started. So one thing that got asked a lot in previous talks and in prepping for this one was, what are the most important and impactful things a fashion brand can do to focus on as they try to shift to more sustainable practices? And you and I both agree, you have to talk about this from a small and medium-sized enterprise point of view, as well as a large enterprise point of view, and there was actually a great question in the chat from Anna saying, how can small brands help mitigate greenhouse gas emissions on the spinning, weaving, processing level when they don't have much influence or relationship with their actual suppliers? So can we tackle that from a small business and then from a large business point of view?
Yeah, well, it's a great question because it kind of is directly the heart of the challenge for small and medium-sized companies. And we have, NSI just produced a roadmap, which really goes into these things in more detail. If we don't, if you do not find my response sufficient. But for small and medium-sized brands, speaking about greenhouse gas emissions, just narrowly, it's really hard. And so that isn't the place, if I were a small and medium-sized company, that I would necessarily start. I think in terms of the guidance that we have for small and medium-sized brands, the role that you can really play is on how you're communicating what it is that you are doing. And so, first of all, if you're thinking about how to design a product, that you're designing your product for longevity. And when we think about then, what does that mean in terms of material sourcing? Instead of thinking about like, oh, it needs to be a sustainable material, think instead about what is the best material for this product. Because we see some really strange outcomes when it's led by a belief that something is more sustainable than the rest. So if you really
describe a bizarre outcome from something like that.
So we've seen, without naming a brand, a collection that's like, quote, a sustainable collection. And we've seen like a sundress, and the sundress was made out of recycled polyester, which I'm sure we can go into later, but recycled polyester, like from a pure greenhouse gas emission, still has a higher footprint than your conventional cotton would be. So if you are led thinking, oh, this is a more sustainable material, you're going to then choose that material over like a breathable cotton thing, which me as a person potentially purchasing that, like, I'm going to wear the cotton garment longer because that's going to feel better. And so that's why I think like, from a design perspective, really thinking about like, what is the material that should be used? And then after that, looking at, okay, given the material that I want to use, what are the certifications that we can get and look for material suppliers that are coming up with those certifications. And on that chart, we've mapped the certifications onto those impact areas. So then I think, and the hard part, as the Anne, whoever asked that question, had said, is that none of the certifications right now, some of them look at emissions, but none of them have concrete timelines for reductions of emissions in mills. So it's really almost impossible for small and medium-sized brands to have that sort of impact. So that's why it makes a lot of sense then to really focus on how are you communicating the reduction of impact, so that it's clear that some impact is still happening, some of it is outside of your control, but these are the things that you are working on. And then for larger brands, they do have a different responsibility because they do have tend to have more sway with their suppliers and more capacity to do the benchmarking of their suppliers. And so for large companies, it's really doing the homework of mapping your actual supply chain, benchmarking that supply chain, publishing that benchmark so that the public, we know what it is you're doing, publish the targets that you are setting for yourselves and what you are doing to achieve those targets. And that's how we actually move the needle. That's how we can see progress and know that progress is actually happening versus some of the more vague things that we've been seeing.
All right, so I'll do another question. One of the other things that we got were about marketing claims. We got a lot of questions about brand language, brand claims that are typically marketed to us as sustainable practices. And I'd love to demystify a couple of them. And we can go through these kind of quickly. First one is clothing made from recycled water bottles or ocean plastic. We hear a lot about this. People are very excited to put it on their hang tag or to market it to us in emails. And a lot of these things are done for technical fabrics. So let's talk about clothing made specifically from recycled water bottles.
Yeah, so recycled polyester is pretty much all made from, I'm pretty sure I'm accurate in saying that, from recycled plastic bottles. That is the feedstock for our PET recycled polyester. And I think, listen, like when we first were seeing this, we thought it was great. Until unfortunately we did research and it was less great. And the reason why it is less great than we initially had thought is we have to understand the market context for these different materials. And right now, the claim is, one of the claims is that this recycled polyester is taking plastic out of landfill, which is mostly false. And I say mostly false, and I will be a lawyer on this one. It is mostly false because most of the recycled polyester suppliers are not actually working on the front end of retrieving plastic bottles. So what they are doing is they are in an open marketplace purchasing these recycled plastic bottles. And the reason why it is not going into landfill is because we, the consumers of plastic bottles, have put it in the recycling bin. And so it's not, it is a false claim mostly, unless the suppliers actually working on the front end to get the plastic bottles that would end up in landfill or end up in the ocean. Some of those companies are working on that. And then the other thing just to keep in mind is that the bottling and packaging industry is cannot get enough of the recycled plastic bottle. So it's not that there's some excess sitting there. That is the easiest plastic to recycle. And the bottling industry wants it already. So it's not, a company isn't doing amazing things for the world by using recycled polyester. Having said that, it does have a lower carbon footprint than virgin polyester, but it also doesn't have a lower carbon footprint than any natural fibers. So again, that's why like we have to move away from thinking about these things in black or white, like sustainable versus not.
Right. One of the things I tell people often when they want to use recycled poly is that, what's going to happen is that you then have a linear system where you kind of can't put that jacket back into.
Oh yes, thank you.
It can't be recycled. You can't throw your polar fleece into the plastic recycling and have the guys take it and recycle it like they would a plastic bottle. So
yeah, and yes, that is a critical component of this, is that the plastic bottle can become another plastic bottle, not in an infinite loop, but several more times than polyester, which once we don't have scalable solutions to take our recycled polyester and make it into something.
Okay, awesome. You know what I'm gonna do is, we're getting so many good questions. I'm gonna hop back and forth between a couple of different things. So, Mirandy asked, I think sustainability is a turnoff for some companies because it automatically has a connotation that it costs more money. Is there a way to look at this from a financial perspective where businesses can win from implementing sustainable practices? We get this one all the time. So what would you say to that?
I think there are two directions to answer this question. One is, yes, some of the solutions are cost saving. Clean by Design has a great program with mills that are about building efficiency and energy efficiency, which is just like very simple cost saving. I think other companies that have gone down this path have found that actually knowing who their suppliers are, there is a cost benefit to that and a reduction in risk. So yes, I can answer that question in the way in which I'm supposed to answer that, which is like, yeah, you can totally do this and save money and it's all great. That isn't always the case. However, what I can also say is that whatever a company thinks costs money or not, the people are changing, consumers are changing. It was The Economist that recently did a survey that found that 51% of young people like believe in socialism. So you might not, like, as a company, want to get on board with sustainability, but your customers are. And so if you don't do it, there can be financial problems because you won't have customers at the end of the day. So I think there are some easier wins. There are some things that aren't as costly as people believe, and it's really just a change in an openness and a shift in mindset. And so I think the last thing that we want is that, and what we're seeing a lot, is that this is being driven like from a place of fear. And I remember sitting on some, in industry conversations, and the biggest concern is, that a factory will have collapsed and a company didn't even know that they were doing production there.
Right.
And that's such a sad, like, way in which to approach one's work, when it can be something that is really a growth opportunity. And the world is changing anyway, so might as well get on board and lead the change.
And in an era when we have the possibilities of, Zooming all day long and being as connected as we are, it makes the case for being more connected to our supply chain. Whenever I talk to people outside of our industry, the first thing you have to explain to them is that fashion brands don't actually own their supply chain. So when they ask why a big brand isn't doing it better, I have to explain that the big brand owns not one single one of their factories or mills. It's all outside contractors. So,
and that's like such a I mean, if you think about history, such a recent shift that this has happened. Like early brands came out from, like, they were factory owners that launched brands. And then merchant brands like came in, and we had globalization, and then that shifted. So it's like it's nothing about what we're doing right now is inevitable. These things like can shift and do shift, and are shifting all the time. So it's just a matter of openness to do it. And like, and NSI and, you know, other organizations even on this call are here to help. Like, it's, as a brand, you're not alone.
Um, we we just got a question that I have to ask because it's one of you and I's favorite topics that we talk about in our friendship together, which is what Ingrid's asking, what can we do to help push on a policy level to make sure brands big and small have to by law disclose labor practices and where their material comes from. You and I have talked a lot about the role of um, policy, good corporate governance, but then also things happening from a policy level internationally about what these things are, how to, you know, how to disclose them, what people need to disclose, all of that. So do you want to,
Yeah.
do you want to take that?
Yeah. So, you know, at the moment, it is very much brands self-policing. There is enough, like, just academic evidence, that has never worked in any other industry. So we shouldn't like just believe that it will magically work with ours. Um, so this is not something, again, putting my lawyer hat on, this is not something that we should expect. And, you know, quite frankly, with NSI, not what we are advancing ultimately. And I think it's better for the industry that it's just the rules of doing business, and that makes it a level playing field, versus, you know, a big company gets targeted the most just because they're big, you know, which we see a lot in our industry. So yes, these things ultimately should be regulated at a state level. We see some advances in that. There is a French law that companies have to have um, uh, social reporting. And so there are kind of, there, under the surface, there are lawyers and policymakers that are working. California is thinking about and has laws on the books related to chemical management. So there, yes, the short answer is these should be laws, but lawmakers themselves need to be educated about what these issues are. And I think it they haven't. I think fashion, outside of fashion, is so often dismissed as something superficial and girly. And I have a personal mission in life. It's for people to not dismiss it as such, because it does have such a big impact, and needs to be regulated and thought of in the same way that other industries that have same impacts are as well.
I always describe it as everybody eats food, everybody wears clothes. So we are missing a few regulations if we're going to be anything close to the food industry. Um, so let's go back to another marketing claim. What about dead stock fabric? Is it really sustainable?
So it's an interesting one. Dead stock, um, in one way, yes, you're not producing a material that a virgin material. So yay, congratulations, that is more sustainable. But it's often a claim that you see smaller companies doing because they can, because they're at a smaller scale. And it is not, it is something that larger companies have more difficulty doing because there's not enough stock available of dead stock. And they are the companies producing the dead stock at the end of the day. So it's a little bit of a symbiotic relationship. So a little, and and there are, I just want to give a shout out to Jessica Schreiber, who's over at Fab Scrap, working on really helping in the New York area distribute dead stock material, making it available. So it is it's a good way of thinking about design, but seems a little unfair to call that sustainable when it exists within a system that is producing the dead stock. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What about local production?
Yeah, hear that one a lot, and that we talk about that one a lot. That is often a claim that small and medium-sized companies do. Sometimes they have to because they're not at a scale for the larger factories that are abroad. And people, I think that because we can visualize distances, that global production has a massive footprint. But the shipping itself is actually quite efficient. And when we look at the supply chain shipping, and not all products are shipped, some of them are air freighted, and that does increase impact a lot. But if they are shipped, that's actually only 1% of the total emissions. So, and a lot of times people say local production, but their fabric is not locally produced. So that is not really very sustainable at all. That's just wrong. um, so I think, we have to know what we are, be transparent in communication about what actual local production actually means. Not that I'm against it, it's great. Local production is great, but let's not make false claims.
I would also put in there, know the conditions of your local suppliers, because, sometimes those local suppliers are not actually making a wage that's appropriate for where they live, et cetera. So, or working in conditions that are grossly unfair. So we just got a question about I think this is in response to our conversation about synthetic textiles. Should consumers completely avoid garments that include synthetic textiles? This might be a good place to jump into one of the things you and I talk a lot about, which is shopping our way into sustainability.
Yeah, so should consumers, well, first of all, I try to avoid the word consumer, because when even the use of that word, there is research on how that activates people's consumeristic behavior. And so it's interesting that we do use that word all the time when we are people and citizens. In thinking about the role that people and citizens can play, well, first I'll answer the synthetic actual question. I think again, just as I was talking about what small and medium-sized companies should do in thinking about the materials that they are sourcing and how they're thinking about design, I say the same for people who are purchasing things. What is it that you are actually looking for, and what is it that you actually need? So buying something just because it's marketed as sustainable is actually not doing anything sustainable. Not buying the thing is actually the most sustainable thing. So let's not forget that. And then if you are actually seeking something out, then get the thing that you're going to wear the most, because so much of sustainability is in the use and using it more. And you can really cut down your emissions, the emissions embodied in that product, by wearing the product more. So I am a little less focused on what material I'm looking for and more on do I really love this thing? And for me, when I am using that lens, what I love tends to be natural fibers because they feel better. But I'm also not I still wear a sports bra and it's not cotton. So there are uses.
Go try to find yoga pants that don't contain synthetic fibers, and then see if you like them at all, because I promise.
One thing we haven't mentioned with synthetic fibers, which is critical to the whole thing, are the plastic microfibers and ocean pollution. And there's just like new data coming out all the time about where we're finding all of this plastic microfiber. And we don't know exactly the impact that it has, except that it's just sticking around, entering our food supply, and we're eating it and drinking it. So that's another reason not to use synthetics. So yeah, if you can avoid them, it's great. But I would, like, as a citizen, I would be driven more by what is it that I'm actually seeking out and getting something that's going to last the longest.
So the more sustainable decision is to buy the thing that you are going to wear and keep for a long time.
Or even a step before that, like what, why am I buying it?
Right. All right. Let's talk about sustainable packaging. How much of the full, I know you love this question, how much of the full picture is sustainable packaging? Sometimes I think brands come to their packaging first because it's one of the things that they feel they have the most control over. But how much of a piece of the pie is that? Or
It's
how?
not. It is a small part of the pie. It's not nothing. So like, great, go do it. But that's not like the area of main focus. And I think I also think that if you then market that you've done this, well, I've seen a lot of just like confusion around what sustainable packaging is. But when we're looking at the whole impact from a brand, packaging is not a component of it. Like material, again, the mills are really, I'm just going to keep saying mills all the time.
Right, it's fine.
That's the real hotspot. So it's not to say like don't think about it, but I think there is this, we get like, where can I get a sustainable like hang tags? And that's not going to be the thing that is going to get us to live in a planet that we can all thrive in. So that wouldn't be like the first priority. And then I would also just add that because talking about packaging, which is talking about like marketing claims, that there is research that if a company is putting like labeling around something is sustainable, or if it's circular, like this comes from something that is recycled, there's actually evidence that it makes people consume more. So think about that when you're like marketing. I love your books and how they're color coordinated.
You can kind of see my OCD, but it's just right behind me. I wanted to address the innovation question. I mean, we are in right now, I think fashion is one of those places where innovators are flocking to because as has been evidenced in the last 40 minutes of conversation, there are lots of places that need to be cleaned up. We haven't had major innovation in fashion since the automatic knitting machine. So for those startups, this is from D in the Netherlands, how can these innovative, sustainable startups, how can they scale more quickly? There are companies working on dyeing, textile production, turning trash into textiles, regenerative practices. How can we get to scale quicker? I mean, if you can answer that, I think, you'll be a gazillionaire tomorrow because everybody's trying to crack that code. But what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think for me, like we need innovation, right? We need investment in circular design, circular production. How can we reuse chemicals? How can we reuse raw material? How can we recycle plastic that isn't plastic bottles? How, there's amazing new technology around agriculture and surgical application of pesticides and that whole space. So there's a ton of area that is needed for innovation. But a lot of the stuff in fashion is actually that's creating the most impact and that would like really move the needle is on really basic things. Really basic things like energy efficiency in really like old mills. So there's been so much desire to innovate our way out of this that doesn't take into account really the basics. And so I think that's an issue. As a company that is working on innovations, I think the thing to do is really, again, be clear on what part of this impact are you working on, and have it be measurable and measured by a third party. Because I think if the more we move into that direction of data and disclosures, both from the brand side, but from the innovation side as well, then you're really setting yourself up as a company to be adopted by more and more players. And so that's how you scale, is you get a big player on board with your idea. But I've seen some crazy things. Like I was in China, and I was so excited because I thought I was seeing chemical recycling, and it was not that. It was a big like show and tell on mechanical recycling. So that means like the fibers just like cut up and then respun. And the big innovation was supposed to be that it was like a machine could do the sorting, the color sorting. And I'm like looking at this innovation, and the machine, from what I could see, was colorblind. Like it was all putting all the stuff in the green bin. So like, and all of these huge companies were there, like looking to invest. And so so anyway, I think we 1,000%, like, and brands need to invest more. Big brands need to invest more in innovation, but there are really basic things that we need to do that are really obvious fixes first, or not first, at the same time.
Yeah, I would say to
Yeah.
to give my perspective, being somebody who works with innovators a lot, is the things that I see taking off and the things that I see having the most potential to get from pilot to scale are the ones where they fit into the existing infrastructure, where they have designed their innovation to work with existing systems, because the capital expenditure required usually to bring on these new technologies is so overwhelming that brands don't have the will or the budget usually, and mills certainly do not. So I've seen huge steps forward when brands, I've worked with a fabric finisher who wanted to put in non-toxic finishes, and they realized that what they had to do was design their system to work with the current system that was in there, but just remove the toxic finishes and put in the clean finishes, or working within current solvent systems to create new textiles out of garment waste. So I think that's my other piece of advice in terms of that.
Yeah, definitely.
Ooh, we just got the vegan leather question. Should we talk about vegan leather and what it actually is?
It's plastic. Yeah, I think it's so interesting because these conversations like around sustainability and veganism, like they get collapsed. And I think, again, it's like really just a matter of being clear of what it is what are you trying to advance? And if it's an ethical thing that you don't want to engage with animals, like then you've made that ethical decision, but it doesn't mean that it's the sustainable decision. because vegan leather is just a rebrand of pleather. Like it's literally rebranded pleather, which is plastic leather, which was just cheap leather before. Yeah, that's vegan leather.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe we've got 10 minutes left and we've got about 1 million questions. So I just want to say to everybody that we will get to answering all of these. We just won't be able to do it today. But let's do one more, which is we've gotten quite a few questions about take back programs and about and I know we can't talk about one brand specifically versus another. And so let's just talk about it as an overview of typically what happens in a take back program.
Yeah. So
do brands have the responsibility, in your view, to take back their garments at the end of their life?
I mean, it's an interesting like movement that is happening on the responsibility of companies, and this is a movement even outside of fashion. So I think it's an interesting one, but what we are seeing on the ground right now, and this is not every player, Patagonia, Eileen Fisher, they are not an example of what I'm about to describe. But the large players that we are seeing so far, the take back programs are not actually being used to create new garments. So the work is, what we're seeing is a lot of these take back programs are very similar to donating to Goodwill, except that they well, some of them do donate funds. But when you give a garment to a Goodwill or a lot of these take back programs, what is happening is a Goodwill will put it in their store for a few weeks. And if it doesn't sell, and something like 15% gets sold, so most of it is not getting sold, that product will either, if it's of such, like if it's stained or something, will be turned into a rag if it's cotton. And that is normally single use, or the bulk of it gets sorted and shipped to the developing world. And that circles back to the very beginning of our conversation, because what we're finding is that in the developing world, there is just so much product coming in, and it is by and large of such low quality that it isn't finding a market there. And it's sold there. Like none of this isn't like besides you donating it, that's the end of the donation part. After that, it's a business. And the back end of these big companies is similar. They use the same distributors and sellers going to the developing world. And what we're finding is that, for example, there is great research done in Ghana that in the Continental market in Ghana, which is the secondhand clothing market there, 40% of the garments are never even sold. And so they end up having to landfill. And it is, when I was there, I went to visit the landfill and it was on fire, and it was over full, and they didn't have the protective measures in place. And so all of that synthetic clothing was burning and going into the atmosphere. And so we really like these take back programs. Not all of them are like that. And some are really about like repurposing and how do we like recreate, and like there are companies in the US that are working on that. So we have to know which ones we're talking about when we talk about take back programs, but they are definitely not all alike.
So something like an Eileen Fisher or Patagonia, where it's take back with a plan to give it another life.
Yep. Which is something, yeah, very different than, and then I think, like, again, to keep in mind when we're talking about these take back programs is the moral hazard there, which is the evidence that we find that when people believe that their product is going to find a second life, it causes them to consume more of the product. So we have to, like, our planet is literally on fire, and we have to be realistic about what it is that we are doing and what are we actually achieving when we're doing these making these decisions.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe how fast that went by. I am always just so grateful to get to talk to you because you are one of the most deeply studied people I know on this topic, and yet you're super fun to talk to. But I would love for you to just talk quickly about what's coming up for the NSI. You guys have a couple of exciting things happening. Can you talk about your master classes and things like that?
Yeah, so we have launched a masterclass. We just did our first one yesterday, but they will be ongoing, and we will go through like what are the major areas of impact and what can people do, whether they are media, citizens, or brands themselves. So you can sign up for that on our website, and then we launched the roadmap, which I talked about, so we can people who want kind of more details on guidance, again, as citizens, media, or brands on what to do to start driving reductions in this space. And then other things coming up is we will have a report that's looking into different industry efforts to measure impacts, material impacts. So that report will be coming out shortly, so we can look out for that. And then we'll be launching an information platform. So it's all the data that we have found in one accessible, searchable place. And we hope that that will be a community destination that folks can add new data as it becomes available. And we also grade the data on how reliable the source of the information is, because there's a lot of bad data out there. And we need to fix that if we're going, you only manage what you measure. And so we have to do a good job of measuring it, what it is we're doing in this industry. So all of that is coming up, and people can find us at newstandardinstitute.org or on social at NSI Fashion 2030.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming today. I want to thank everybody who came and participated, and it was there's a very lively Q&A. If anybody still has questions, please submit them on the This Is Now Live website, and we will make sure that Maxine and I answer these in some form or fashion for you. I want to thank the team at BPCM. I want to thank George McPherson, Dewey Bunfell, Kathy Asimovic, Jade Seidenberg, and encourage you all to please, if you are in America, please go out and vote. These are the kinds of things that we are voting for. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.